Joseph, we're in Walsingham today, walking around, and you know that this was the site for England to be consecrated to the Immaculate Heart. Did you know about that?
I do know, but I've heard about it very recently. In fact, I really do believe that if there's going to be a genuine Catholic rebirth in this country, it's going to begin in Walsingham.
Yeah. I mean,
this is the heart. This basically is the heart, literally the heart of Catholic England, where we're standing now.
That's right. Walsingham is an out-of-the-way place, forgotten by many, not heard of by many. So was Nazareth.
So was Nazareth.
So was Bethlehem to some extent.
And if you talk about other Marian apparitions, so was Lourdes.
So was Lourdes.
So was Fatima. Yeah. I mean, these were not, it's not Lisbon, right? It's not Paris, right? It's not Jerusalem. It's these out-of-the-way villages, the small and beautiful places of God.
Yeah.
I first came here in the late 1980s when I was on my journey to conversion, and it's not an exaggeration at all to say this place changed my life.
Really?
I came here, I think probably the first time I came here I may have cycled here. I used to live in Norwich, it's about 30 miles from here, and I cycled here and there was pilgrimages going on, and I was just taken up in the spirit of the place. It felt like lifted up, and I was never the same again. I mean, if I was toying with the idea or dabbling with the idea of conversion, after coming to Walsingham, no, I was absolutely gung-ho. This is what I needed to do, and it felt as if I'd been lifted up by grace. In other words, propelled forward by grace I received by coming here. And Our Lady of Walsingham is right at the centre of my prayer life. You know, our evening prayers back home in America, right? We pray to Our Lady of Walsingham every day.
Really?
Yeah.
I like to think of you, Joseph, in that far continent, with a little statue of Our Lady of Walsingham. Do you have such a thing in your home?
We certainly have a statue of Our Lady of Walsingham in our home. Yes, you bet. You bet.
So there's a little bit of England in South Carolina.
There is a corner of South Carolina which will be forever England. Yes, indeed.
That's amazing. That's wonderful. Do you like coming back to England?
I do. It's a bit of a wistful experience because England's changing all the time, and I'm away. So every time I come back, I feel almost like a stranger in my own homeland when I return now, and that I find sad.
I mean, if we felt too at home.
No abiding city, right? No abiding city. And it's been good for me. It's been good for me because what I love about England, quite frankly, the cities move in the fast lane, right? So every time you come back, there are buildings that weren't there last time you were here, and even streets that have disappeared. But you come back to a village like Walsingham, and I've been here many times, and not quite as often as I used to, but it's essentially unchanged. So it moves in slow motion in time, and of course in spirit, it's partaking of eternity. This place as a Marian shrine exists, if you like, in a place that's beyond the place itself. It's metaphysical, it transcends. Yeah. And so you can come here and feel at home. I can come back to Walsingham and feel at home always. I can't go back to London, which is where I was born, and feel at home.
Yeah. I mean, I find this, just listening, the greenery, it's Tolkien-esque.
It is, you know, and this is Norfolk, and for Tolkien, of course, Warwickshire was the Shire. But for me, Norfolk is the Shire. It's where I spent the last 13 years I was in England. And there is something quintessentially Hobbit-like about the villages, the market squares, the churches. Yeah. Somehow or other Tolkien managed to encapsulate something of the essence of medieval rural England in his depiction of the Shire in The Lord of the Rings and in The Hobbit. And we get that spirit when you're here. When you're in Walsingham, the Norfolk countryside, these places, the stones are centuries old, the oak trees are centuries old. There's a place, you know, that time moves slowly here. Yes. And that's essentially getting the Shire, I think, is that nothing changes very quickly here, and we like it that way.
In the church over the Anglican church, St. Mary's, they have the bell that used to be here in the priory.
Oh really? I did not know that.
Bell.
Wow.
Same bell.
That's amazing.
So even though you hear the bell from over there,
right, it belongs here.
It belongs here.
It
still rings out in these
Exactly.
bells.
Yes, indeed. It's pining for home.
Pining for home. So how does it make you feel, Joseph, when you see something like this? You know, something with so much history.
Well, obviously, I mean, it cuts to the core of what it is to be an Englishman for me, as well as what it is to be a Catholic. Because to me, the true England is the Catholic England. I mean, there was a 1,000 years, you know, from Alban, the first martyr under the Romans, right through to the dissolution of the monasteries in the 1530s. There's over 1,000 years of Catholic history, and of course, that Catholic English history continues afterwards. The recusants, the courageous defiance to the secular tyranny, right through to the Catholic revival from Blessed John Henry Newman onwards. To me, this is the glorious true England, the England of which, if you like, that I identify.
And one of the titles for England, one of its greatest titles, is obviously Mary's Diary.
Yeah.
And am I right in thinking that there's maybe an allusion to it in Shakespeare?
Yes, well, indirectly, in the sense that in Macbeth, we have the discussion in Macbeth about the English king, St. Edward the Confessor, who was the king at the time of the apparition here in 1061. And the point in the play is that we have this saintly king of England who's is so holy that when he just touches his subjects, their miraculous healing taking place. So there's this, if you like, this tribute to St. Edward the Confessor in Macbeth as a way of showing this is what a true king should be. A true king should be a saint, not a Machiavellian like Macbeth. You know, to me, this is, I think Anglo-Saxon England, which of course comes down catastrophically with the Norman conquest, a few short years after the apparition, it's as if Anglo-Saxon England dies in a supernova. You know, that the brightest, most glorious moment is immediately before the sun sets or the star dies. But of course, you know, with Christianity, it's never just death, right? Whenever there's a death, you're awaiting the resurrection, and that's what we saw. So we've seen the history of Walsingham becoming one of the premier shrines of medieval Europe. You know, alongside Santiago de Compostela, Rome, Jerusalem, Canterbury, Walsingham, and kings upon kings, you know, came here on pilgrimage for, again, hundreds of years, and then again the curtain comes down, right? This time because of the English Reformation under King Henry VIII.
That's right, and am I right in thinking that King Edward made some sort of prophecy on his deathbed? Have you heard this?
No, I haven't. No, tell me, please, please.
I think I'm right in saying that he made some sort of prophecy about Walsingham, that it would be suppressed or destroyed in sort of 300 years.
Oh, wow.
Which is roughly the time scale.
Wow.
St. Edward the Confessor, it's interesting, the link, because he's such a key figure in English history.
Yes.
I mean, in Westminster Abbey, there is still a Catholic Mass on the anniversary of his death.
I know Pope Benedict made a point of kneeling and praying at St. Edward the Confessor's tomb when he was on his visit to England to beatify John Henry Newman. So again, we have this wonderful connection. We have to almost 1,000 years apart, right? The 11th century, late 11th century, St. Edward the Confessor, and then we've got the 19th century, mid-19th century, the conversion of Newman. So this continuum, this Catholic continuum, which to me is the heart of what it is to be English.
And I think England, probably more than any other country in Europe, there's a kind of a secret history. Would you agree? There's a kind of the public history. Right. Which is, I'm not just talking about the Whiggish history, but there's been a public history which is airbrushed out.
Yes.
Another history which is like a stream. I think Ronald Knox called it a sort of hidden stream.
Yes.
Running through English history.
A book I want to write, this is on my wish list of books not to read but to write, is I want to write a book called A History of True England, and basically talk about Catholic England from, say, St. Alban, the proto-martyr, right through to the present day. And this is the true England. This is the history of the England that's been true to the faith, true to her God, true to her lady, right, Our Lady's Dowry. It's lived up to that title, and it's the England to which all of us, I think, can belong.
It's interesting, the title dowry, because dowry implies a gift.
Right.
The giving of something. And something as significant as giving a nation to Our Lady is not something that's ever been sort of rescinded.
Right, no.
We can be unfaithful to it.
Right, and we have.
Yeah. But England is still Mary's Diary.
Yes.
I mean, do you see a prophetic nature?
I do. I see. We see that the role that England has played in history, for good, bad and ugly, but I do think that there's something that our Lord and his mother have blessed this nation in a very splendid, unique, wonderful, in the full sense of the word, you know, a way which is full of wonder. Why us? You know, and it's the exaltation of you know, of the humble. We're not worthy. We know we're not worthy, and certainly should never be a source of pride. It should be a source of awe-inspiring humility. That, you know, why would God and His Mother find this miserable corner of the world so special?
So, Joseph, obviously, with all your books and writing on Chesterton and Belloc, you're very aware of their sort of reinterpretation of England's history and England's place in the greater sort of Christendom story.
Absolutely. I mean, for Belloc, of course, he made it a mission of his life to retell English history as it should be told. In other words, in accordance with the truth, as opposed to the Whig version of history, which is basically Protestant propaganda, airbrushing the whole Catholic dimension, which is the core and heart of what England is and English history is. So he made it almost a life mission, writing book after book after book, looking at the history of England in the 16th and 17th century. And Belloc's position was, I think was probably correct, that if the English had not succumbed under Henry to the English Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, the continent would never have taken off. You know, England was the decisive blow that allowed the Reformation to actually find its feet, if you see what I mean.
And what Belloc's also very good at doing, more so maybe even than Chesterton, is looking at the different reformations within English history, or within British history.
Right.
Because once the union of Scotland and England and Ireland, it all becomes a sort of British story of, I mean, the kind of counter, backwards and forwards, Catholic, Protestant, ending, I suppose, with the Whiggish version, Glorious Revolution, or what we might say, the Inglorious Revolution.
Right. Yes, yes.
And it's a tragedy that the true British kings, Stuarts, were deposed by essentially a Dutch coup d'etat.
Absolutely. I mean, it was a coup d'etat, and it was a revolution. They can stick the adjective glorious in front of their light, but it's a revolution. In other words, the legitimate king, the legitimate monarch was overthrown by a usurper. That's actually what happened then. And then, of course, the Stuarts are forced into exile, and we have these two Jacobite uprisings in the 18th century. And and beyond that, I mean, in the Lord of the Rings, now the whole ethos of the return of the king, the awaiting for the return of the king, both in the Lord of the Rings and in the Hobbit, right, with the Thorin Oakenshield, is all resonant with that Jacobite longing for the king in exile that we're waiting to return, the true king, the true Catholic king of England, for him to come back to English shore.
And even for a number of years, I mean, the Stuarts were not only a romantic folklore, but they also had a kind of quasi-almost religious significance for the British nation. And you probably know that water was not allowed at certain royal tables because of the toast for the king over the water.
I do know that, yes, indeed.
There's something in our mental, spiritual makeup that waits for the king.
Absolutely, and certainly I take great delight when I'm giving talks in the United States to showing people how to toast the true king. If you find yourself, in the presence of a British social dinner, and then the toast is the Queen, and you say the Queen, and you pass your wine over the water, because you're toasting the true king or the true queen, the true monarch, the Jacobite monarch, over the water. And I love telling the Americans that, to really sort of make them understand that we're still awaiting the return of that king.
I think this would have been the refectory.
Whenever I see this scenario, which obviously in Walsingham, different parts of the village, you see it, I'm reminded of Shakespeare's sonnet about the bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang, because the sweet birds in that sonnet's about the monks and the religious brothers and the nuns that were all basically made homeless almost overnight by Henry VIII. So the sweet birds, they were the sweet birds that sang to the Lord in places like this, and it's a travesty and a tragedy. But yet, there's something about Christianity that the crucifixion is integral to the resurrection. And this, if you like, it's like a cross or a crucifix. It shows the sins of man and the suffering of the holy at the hands of sinful man. And I think it speaks in a different way, but it speaks in the same way as if it wasn't ruined. When I find myself in these scenarios, I can't help but just take myself back to Shakespeare's England, because Shakespeare was living at a time when this was happening, when the church was under attack, where it was illegal to be a Catholic priest in England, punishable by death, where it was punishable by death to hide a Catholic priest in England. So there are lessons to be learned, you know, from that time. Secular fundamentalism is something which has been a recurring part of human history. I mean, we see it with Herod in the Gospel, Pontius Pilate in the Gospel, the crucifixion of our Lord as a consequence of the secularism, okay? And that crucifixion is reenacted, you know, in every single generation. We see it here in the English Reformation. We saw it reenacted again in the Soviet Union in the 20th century, and in the Third Reich in the 20th century, the rise of secular fundamentalism. And of course, we're living with that again in our 21st century in manifold ways.
So in some ways, what you're saying, Joseph, is that this isn't a relic. This is a contemporary artifact of some sort.
Yeah, it's a living icon. It's a living icon. I say it's like a crucifix that passes through the decades and the centuries, and it inspires. It inspires us to meditate upon the reality of sin, the reality of the suffering that's caused by sin, and the resurrection. Because for Christian, the crucifix and the crucifixion are never separable from the resurrection that comes from it. So we can see this, and we can see it, if you like, as a tomb. But you know, we also see it as a God who defeats the tomb.
I think you're starting to quote Chesterton.
Yes, indeed. I find it very difficult not to. I mean, Chesterton talks about the end of the everlasting man, that, you know, we worship a God that rose from the grave, that defeats death. You know, that's why even in the midst of the sorrowful mysteries of the Rosary, there's joy and there's glory. That if you like, the mysteries of the Rosary are themselves triune, right? That we can't be sorrowful in a nihilistic, despairing sense as Christians, because there's always the resurrection following on. So you can look at the ruins and see them as that living icon, passing through centuries to inspire us, if you like, to look upon the crucified Lord, and beyond that to the resurrection.
I remember when you wrote about England, Merry England, and it was written just before you emigrated to the United States.
It was actually written just after. It was written literally in my first months in the United States. It was originally published as a column in the St. Austin Review, the magazine I edit, shortly after I moved to the States. And it's full of a wistfulness because, you know, I'd lived in England for 40 years. So it's not as if I was a young man on a new adventure. I was an old man in some ways, certainly a middle-aged man who had spent my whole life in England. I was English to the core, and now I'm in this new world. And looking back upon my life in England, looking back upon my memories of England. So I allowed myself, if you like, in that book, A Merry England, A Journey Through the Shire, to wander around my favourite places. And I would say significantly, the final place, because it has to be the final place for any pilgrimage around England, is to come to Walsingham. That has to be the culmination of any Englishman's wandering around his homeland. So in the book, and in the column in the magazine, Walsingham is the final destination. In some sense, in that sense, symbolic of heaven, right? It's coming home to our mother. This world is a land of exile. It's a valley of tears. It's a vale of tears. Now, I love the word vale of tears because you have vale as in V-A-L-E and vale as in V-E-I-L, because we don't see the fullness of the glory of God in these shadowlands. We see it through a veil or through a glass darkly. And I think that's part of the spiritual wistfulness of the book.
I think that's probably what I was picking up on.
The point is, I think the theology of place, which was so important to, for instance, for Hilaire Belloc and for me and for J.R. Tolkien, is universal. That we all feel that the part of the world, if you like, which nurtures us, nourished us culturally, in which we lived and grew up and matured, is home. But it's only home up to a point. It's not fully satisfying as a home. So you have that theology of place, but you know that the home itself, in this worldly sense, points to a perfect home. Yes. And that perfect home is heaven.
Yes. It's interesting, we're starting to talk about home, Joseph, and we see a graveyard before us.
Yes, indeed. Well, that's the doorway, isn't it? That's the doorway to home. Ultimately, there's no resurrection unless we die first, right? I mean, all the great art, visual art, literary art, contains the memento mori, you know, the reminder of death, and the reminder of death is supposed to lead us to pondering, contemplating the four last things, you know, death, judgment, heaven and hell. So really, I think it's very good and edifying for us to spend time in the presence of the dead, because one thing's for sure, there's an egalitarianism here. We're all going to die. We're going to die once only, and by the grace of God, you know, that will be the stairway to heaven, the doorway to heaven.
Do you know that essay about walking in Westminster in the tombs of Westminster Abbey, I think it is, Joseph Addison. Do you know that?
No, I should have read much more Addison than I have. So no, please tell me.
Well, it's just the way he describes how, as you say, the egalitarian nature of graveyards.
Right.
No matter how successful you were,
Right.
no matter how long you lived or how short you lived, it's all come to the same point.
One of my favourite poems ever written is by Thomas Gray's Elegy in a Country Churchyard.
Yeah.
And again, same thing, that this rustic person might have been, a Caesar, a Napoleon.
Right.
And of course, same thing in Shakespeare. I mean, in Hamlet, the longest memento mori in literature probably is obviously the graveyard scene with, alas,
Yes.
poor Yorick, I knew him, Horatio. And there's this long, there's the.
Let's not ask for who it tolls. Shall we go, Joseph, towards the real centre of Walsingham, which is where the priory was?
Oh, it would be wonderful to do that, yes.
And as you know, that's where the original Holy House was.
Yes, indeed.
In the distance, I don't know if you can see it there.
Yeah, through the trees, yeah.
Yeah, is the ruins of the priory. And that's where the site of the Holy House was.
You can imagine the majesty of the building just by the size of the one arch that remains. And also, the magnitude of the vandalism of it, because this is the Western heritage, right? These are part of what it is to be a Christian, to our civilization, and it also shows what barbarians in various guises can do with the great works of art and creation that men have erected to the glory of God. It's again, it's inspiring. It's again, as we were saying earlier, it's the sorrowful and the joyful and the glorious, all sort of interwoven in the mystery of fall and redemption.
Whenever I see that, Joseph, there's one word comes to mind. That's poignant.
Yes, absolutely. Poignant. It really pierces. It really pierces the. Should we say, nobody can really experience that on a human level and remain purely materialistic about it, right? It's going to touch your soul, going to touch your spirit, and if it doesn't, quite frankly, you're gollumed, right? You've gollumized yourself. You don't actually see. You've blinded yourself to the beauty and majesty, not just of God, but of man's relationship with God, because that's a work of human creativity, right? Using stones which are made by God, but doing things with it to the glory of God, and that really is, if you like, is the apex of humanity's achievement. And so it has to be poignant. It has to pierce through the purely material, the purely surface level of things, to what we're really about.
It's strange, Joseph, how English Catholicism, a bit like you were saying earlier about Chesterton and the rebirth, and we believe in a God who escape the tomb. In a strange sort of way, don't you think English Catholicism keeps escaping from the tomb that people put it into? Yeah,
I mean, many times in English history you'd have predicted that the faith was dead in this country. Certainly after Henry VIII and the martyrdom of Thomas More and John Fisher, and then the 150 years of relentless persecution, including torture and martyrdom. Mm-hmm. And certainly by the end of that, and then another 150 years of persecution without martyrdom, all sorts of laws stacked against Catholics, 300 years basically, from the 1530s until the 1830s, 1828, Catholic emancipation, 300 years of relentless persecution. You'd have thought that would have signalled the death of the faith in this country. And yet, just at the time when you could have predicted it would die, we have the Second Spring. We have Blessed John Henry Newman converting to the faith in 1845. Mm. Simultaneously, we have a mass influx of Irish working class people moving to England in the wake of the potato famine. So all of a sudden you have a Catholic working class, you have this new Catholic intelligentsia, mm-hmm. with Newman and all the other converts coming in, Manning at that time. Right. And then in the wake of Newman's conversion, this new golden age of Catholic revival with the likes of Chesterton and Belloc.
That's right. And even, I mean, in about the 1890s and 1900s, Edwardian times, Catholicism was quite fashionable. There were a lot of literary figures, a lot of powerful people were converting to Catholicism. It was the religion of choice of the educated and government classes.
Well, I think basically because Newman was so respected and revered as an intellect, as a man of sanctity, as a writer, that if someone like Newman can convert, and the reasons he gave, of course, it did become intellectually fashionable. That all of a sudden the Catholic Church now was where faith and reason met. And so we had this new Catholic intelligentsia, which manifests itself in many ways. I mean, one of the most exciting things for me is a poet like Gerard Manley Hopkins, right? He's a convert to the Catholic faith and then becomes a Jesuit priest. He then becomes perhaps the greatest of all the Victorian poets. And if you think about the Victorian age in literature as a real golden age in English literature, which it was,
yes,
to have, if you like, la creme de la creme, the greatest of those Victorian poets, to be a convert to the faith and then becoming a Jesuit priest, and then the absolute majesty of his poetry.
That's right. And you also had another great poet, Francis Thompson.
Ah.
And I know we both visited his grave in Kensal Green in London, and I think you complained a few years ago about how dilapidated it was, and I went this year in fact, and it's even worse.
Really?
And you know, it's such a shame that people forget somebody like Francis Thompson or even Manley Hopkins is not that well known. I mean, he's well known amongst the literary classes, but we were preeminent poets in their day, and they were converts to the faith, and they were extremely Catholic.
Yeah, I mean, a culture that's not barbaric has a continuum. It respects the past, it respects genius. So really, those should be national tombs. They should actually be paid for, the upkeep of them should be paid for by the national culture, because it's part of our shared inheritance. And so to me, it's almost a metaphor for the decay of modern England. When you see the decay of those graves, it's a metaphor for the whole culture that we now don't have.
That's right.
In the apparition of Our Lady of Walsingham, going right back to 1061, Our Lady gave the Lady of the Manor here a vision of her home when she was a child with her parents. So it's really the Holy House of the Annunciation. It's where the Annunciation, in other words, it's where the incarnation happened. So it's when God becomes flesh is actually in this house. And in some ways, it's more important than the house that they lived in subsequently, because it's here that the central miracle of our redemption happened. And for me, and I think the beauty of this place is that one of my favourite prayers is the Angelus, because I think the Angelus prayer encapsulates the heart of what our relationship with God is. So the angel of the Lord declares unto Mary. So God has to reach out to us first, that's the grace, but then we have to respond. Right, the fiat, be it done unto me, according to thy word. Now, if you like, that her fiat in this house is really at the core of what it is to be a Christian, and how our relationship with God, she shows us what our relationship with God should be in her response to that message.
So Joseph, it's been a wonderful day.
Oh, it's been perfect. One of the things I like best about it, as well as the architecture, was the perfect English weather.
Joseph, thank you very much.
My pleasure, my pleasure. God bless you.
Pleasure being with you.
Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Cheers.